And so we're going to continue our study in Matthew 5 through 7, as soon as my computer catches up with me here. And a little bit of a review. We've been talking about what is known as the Beatitudes, but really, as we talked about it, it should be more about the happy attitudes. It's not about being blessed. In Hebrew, it's actually translated from ashrei. Like we said earlier, after the blessing, after hearing the shofar, hashrei, which means happy is the man. In this case, happy is the man or is the person that does these things, for they shall receive. And so we've gone through a number of different ones, and we are at verse 9 is where we are in Matthew chapter 5. And one of the things I guess I want to reiterate is, as we're thinking about these, it says how blessed or blessed is, so forth. Again, that part really should be translated how happy is the person, and in this case, how. Say I said verse 9. How happy are those who make peace, for they shall be called the sons of God. And all of these up through this point, especially, are about prophecy, because as we look at these things, how blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they will see God. Well, that there is truth in that, but let me back up a little bit to, how blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Well, they're not. While you're mourning, you're not comforted per se. These are prophetic. These are aspects. And so this Matthew 5 again is he's laying out. Messiah is laying out. As I started out, I said, "Tell me you're the Messiah," without saying you're the Messiah. And this is essentially Matthew 5. What he's doing, he's laying out. These are the promises of God, that promises of Adonai, that he's laying out before the people there, and just probably north of Capernaum, which is Capernaum, and he's laying this out. And so we're going to continue on with verse 9 today. It says, how happy are those who make peace, or blessed are those who are peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Now, there's a rabbi named Radak, R-A-D-A-K, is his acronym, and he speaks on Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And I'm not going to read Genesis 1, verse 2, because it's really taking a number of steps away from that verse, that I want to just talk about what he says. So he talks about fire and water during creation. And Radak says that fire and water are considered irreconcilable opposites, so that they can only coexist through the good offices of shalom, a peacemaker. So let me say that again. So Radak is speaking at creation, that with the creation of fire and water, that they can only exist through a peacemaker. And that creation, or that peacemaker, is what we call air, or our atmosphere. It's the only place that fire and water can coexist. And it is considered as such, as it shares some attributes with water and another with fire. The author's basic point, or Radak's basic point, is that without some divine intervention, fire and water could not exist in this physical universe. Interesting thought to kind of start off. Legends of the Jews, chapter 3, verse 2, paragraph, or section 8, I guess it is. After these abominations, Moshe instructed the new judges. So he's talking about after Jethro had come and said, "You need to appoint judges." Moshe instructed the new judges in legal procedure in both civil and criminal cases, and at the same time urged the people not to deny the judges the veneration due them. So he's making sure that the people recognize, hey, you need to respect the judges. And he says, this is why. For great is the importance of justice. For him who hates it, there is no remedy. But the judge who decides conscientiously is the true peacemaker. For the weal of Israel, that's W-E-A-L, of the commonwealth, and indeed of all living creatures. So Rada comes out and brings out these two polar opposites and says, Adonai in his wisdom said these two cannot exist in a regular physical universe. So he created an atmosphere which is called air, which shares both, because they're, my sons, if they were still in here, they would tell you the triangle of fire. You got to have fuel, heat, and air. Air is being one of those. And our air, our atmosphere is also a place where rain comes down and snow comes down, moisture comes down. So water is able to also be in the air. So it's one place that they both can exist. And then we get into the legends of the Jews, and it talks about justice. And within justice, looking for that place where, in a case where there's two opposing opinions, where do we find enough commonality, i.e. the air, for both things to exist? The Hebrew word for peacemaker is shadlav. And the word for peacemaking is shadlanot, which is the plural, or kind of a plural form of it. So shadlav, S-H-A-D, and I put a dash lav, so because it's two syllables. And then you have shad, S-H-A-D, dash L-A-N-O-T, lanot, which would be two syllables in the second part, which is a concept in Hebrew, and especially even modern Hebrew, of lobbying or persuasion. Lobbying or persuasion. I know lobbying's got kind of a bad name because of politics. But at the same time, if we take about it in personal relationships and somebody who's trying to be a peacemaker or a mediator, I guess a moderator too in some degrees, but more of a mediator, they're doing what? They're trying to take, okay, this is what this person is saying that they need. This is what this person is saying they're needing. And they're lobbying, trying to say, can you give and take? Can you give and take a little bit until we can come to an agreeable resolution between two parties? And so this is the idea of peacemaking. It has to do with helping two opposites to come to a realization of a place where they can at least coexist and work together, or at least exist in a similar place, but within the confines of justice. You take those and separate them, you're going to have problems. If you try to just negotiate and create, what's the word I'm looking for? Concessions. Only one side becomes concessions. Well, then you're not really having justice, right? If it's only one-sided, so to speak, it's lopsided, as we say. And so it has to be built within the confines of justice as well. What is right and just within these opposing sides? And so Messiah is saying, those who make peace, how blessed are those who make peace, because it's not always easy. It's always very complicated. I've been in situations where I've made peace. You're a peacemaker, as they say on the side, as law enforcement. And so as law enforcement, you're called peacemaker, and it's not always a blessing when you're trying to make peaceful resolution in a situation of conflict. But Messiah says, for how blessed are those who are striving to make peace, because you're seeking justice and you're seeking peace between each other. Now, peace is not absence of conflict as it's often defined. Peace is better described as harmonious relationship. And that's if you as a peacemaker are able to create a harmonious relationship or an environment, help an environment become a place of harmonious relationship. That's what Messiah is talking about. That is where the blessing is. And for they will be called the sons of God. So this idea of sons of God is mentioned in a number of different places out throughout Scripture. But I want to talk about it a little bit more, and we'll talk a little bit of some of the rabbinics, and then a little bit first, that helps us understand what does it mean to be called the sons of God. Some have a negative connotation, but this one is certainly a positive connotation. So sons of God is mentioned in the Mishnah Torah in Repentance chapter 7. And this is what it says. Repentance brings near to God those that were remote from him. The same man who, but the day before, was despised, condemned, and rejected by God. So here we have opposing sides, right? But with repentance is now beloved, accepted, akin, and a favorite. We see that there was opposites, but then there's a reconciliation as part of this as well. And I lost my spot. And thus, we find that the same expressions wherewith the Holy One, blessed be he, rejected sinners, were used by him. He recalled penitents, individuals, as well as multitudes of men. For it is said, and it shall come to pass that in the place where it is said unto them, you are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God, referencing Hosea chapter 2, verse 10. And then another place in the Talmud, it is Kiddushin 36a, verse 11. Now, according to both Abaya and Rava, these are two rabbis, how do they interpret this verse? You are sons. That is needed for what was taught. You are the sons of the Lord your God. When you behave as sons, you are called sons. Isn't that interesting? They're bringing this thought together. When you behave as sons, you are called as sons. And if you do not behave as sons, you are not called sons. And these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Bringing into this idea that we know from the beginning, God, Adonai, based upon with what Radak was saying, he started with this idea of a concept of peace, making peace within the air for fire and water to exist. When we seek peace on these opposites for other people, we are operating as sons of Adonai. In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer 22:7, he refers to Rabbi Yehoshua or Joshua, said, the Israelites are called the sons of God, as it is said in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1, you are the sons of the Lord your God. The angels are called the sons of God, as it is says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. We see this in Job, referenced in Job chapter 38, verse 7. And while they were still in their holy place in heaven, these were called the sons of God, as it is said after those, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and some became mighty men, which were men of renown. Genesis 6:4, again referencing, there are positive references to sons of God, and there are some negative references to sons of God. But really, the sons of God is referring to what? When we are behaving like sons of God. And this includes angels can also behave as sons as well, or they start out as sons and then they start behaving as they're not supposed to behave, and we get something different as a result. But when we seek peace or seek to be peacemakers, lobbying for people to live in harmony together, we are called, for they will be called sons of God, because we're operating as his sons. Now we move on to verse 10. And again, this is where there's a contradiction here. But when you see it as part of the prophecy, we understand the connection. How blessed or how happy are those who are persecuted because they pursue righteousness? For the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You pull up another tab here. And I want to take a look at Psalm chapter 119. Psalms 119. And we're going to look at 160 through 163, I believe. It says the main thing about your word is that it's true. And there it's an indirect imara, I believe, is the word there that's talking about your word. It's not davar. And imara is an an idiom that refers to the Torah. So it's like your sayings, if you will, your teachings. The main thing about it is that they are true, and we know that this is true. And all of your just rulings last forever. And then it says, princes persecute me for no reason, but my heart stands in awe of your words. I take joy in your promise, like someone who finds much booty. I hate falsehood, I detest it, but I love your Torah. Princes were persecuted for no reason, but yet at the same time, David tells us that he takes joy in his promise. Despite persecution, when we're persecuted for righteous sakes, right? I mean, so if we're persecuted for something that we did wrong, then we kind of deserve it, right? If we just talked about justice, justice says that if I did something wrong, I need to correct it and make it right. Or suffer the consequences of, if you will, of that action that I did. And so let's take that and go to the first reference of what we call the new covenant, Deuteronomy chapter 30. We looked at this before. And we see that there's part of a promise here. Oops. Let's start at verse 1 so we can just again cover our basis and make sure we understand sort of the context. But verse 7 is the one that I'm referencing here. It says, when the time comes that all things have come upon you, both blessing and curse, which I have presented you, and you are there among the nations. Keep in mind, remember, why are they among the nations? Because they didn't keep his Torah. And when we don't keep the Torah, Adonai says in his Torah that, well, then you will not be able to live in the land. And so I will cause you into exile. And in this case, in chapter 30, he's referring to the final exile. And he says that when you are out there in the nations to which Adonai your God has driven you, because we did it to ourselves, then at last you will start thinking about what has happened to you. And you will return to Adonai your God and pay attention to what he has said, which will be exactly what I'm ordering you to do today. So Moses is saying, it's not rocket science, guys. When this happens to you, what I'm telling you today is the same thing you should have been doing, and you should be doing. And he says, you and your children with all your heart and with all your being, which points to the Shema. At that point, Adonai your God will reverse your exile and show you mercy. He will return and gather you from all the peoples to which Adonai your God scattered you. If one of yours was scattered to the far end of the sky, Adonai your God will gather you from even there. He will go there and get you. Adonai your God will bring you back into the land your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. He will make you prosper there, and you will become even more numerous than your ancestors. Then Adonai your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children, so that you will love Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your being, and thus you will live. That right there is the new covenant. The difference between the old covenant and the new covenant is who circumcised. In Deuteronomy, it says we are the one, Deuteronomy chapter 6, we are the one who is to circumcise our hearts. But here in 30, it says Adonai will be the one that circumcised our hearts, which is the same reference to Jeremiah 31 and the same reference in Ezekiel 36, as well as in Hebrews. So it all boils back to right here in 30 verse 6. But the verse I wanted to highlight, so for those that were wondering why I'm calling it the place of the new covenant, this is a reference in the Torah. So for 30 verse 7 says, Adonai your God will put all these curses on your enemies, on those who hated and persecuted you. So Adonai is just, and he says, if you are operating the way these things that's mentioned before, same thing I told you before, Moses says, the same thing I've already taught you, the things that are here in this Torah, if you're doing those things, when this time comes, I will exact justice on those who hated you and persecuted you. But you will return and pay attention to what Adonai says and obey all his mitzvot or commands, which I'm giving you today. Now we go back to, as I said, how happy are those who are persecuted because they pursue righteousness? What is the other part? For theirs, or in this translation, I was working with a different translation, but in the complete Jewish Bible, it says, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Or the other translations, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Similar to a verse we've already read. Verse 3, how blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. So we have poor in spirit being brought together with being persecuted because you're pursuing righteousness. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. These are two things that we have pulled from the Torah and the Tanakh, showing us that faith and trust are the prerequisites for the big S salvation. Always has been and always will be. Which is the kingdom of heaven, which as I said before, if you recall when we did the Shema, I said the rabbis say this is when we are placing, as we chant the Shema, we are placing upon ourselves the yoke of heaven, as we've studied before. But let's go there. Let's go this way. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and let's read it, and let's break it down and see if it's saying what I'm saying in terms of what is the foundations of our faith. So it starts out with verse 4 through 9. Shema Israel, hear, O Israel, but even more so, pay attention, Israel. And not only that, my name, Israel, like kind of saying, my name, hear my name, Israel. Shema, Adonai Eloheinu, I am Adonai, your God. You have to hear his voice and recognize he is your God. Those are all elements of faith. Those are all aspects of faith. And then the third part, Adonai Echad. I am one. Adonai is one. You shall serve no others. Put your faith and your trust in me. Hear who I am. I am the creator of the universe. I am the one calling you. Serve me in faith and truth. So we have to have faith. We have to recognize who he is. And then it goes on into verse 5, and it says, and you are to love Adonai with all your your God with all your heart. Again, a statement of faith. All your being, which is in this case, so you have levavcha, which is our heart, and then you have all your being, your modecha. No, I'm sorry, this is nafshecha. All your being, your nefesh, your soul is, it's often translated. We talked about neshama previously, but the nefesh, with all of our soul, our body, if you will. And then it says, and all your modecha. Modecha is, we often translate it as strength, but strength in terms of a kingdom is in its resources. With the resources that we have, time, money, talents, all these other aspects that are about our lives, we are to serve the Lord with. Again, nothing but faith and trust, if you will, at this point. And then we get into action. As James says, faith without actions or faith without works is dead. And we'll get into a little bit more of that a little bit later in Matthew chapter 5. But it says, and you are to teach them carefully. Oops, did I get it a little too far? Yeah, I did. Verse 6, these words which I'm ordering you today are to be on your heart. We place these on our hearts. Again, part of the new covenant, Adonai will write this Torah on our heart, as Jeremiah 31 through 33 says. He will write his Torah on our heart. But for now, we are to put these on our heart, and we are to teach them carefully to our children, and we are to talk about them when we sit at home, when we are traveling down the road, when we lie down, and when you get up. We are to meditate on his words so that we can carry them out. So we can talk about them to others. And what are we talking about? All the commands that we got to do? Are we doing it as a to-do list, or how great is our God and how wonderful it is to serve him? And then we tie them upon our hand as a sign and put them between frontlets between our eyes. And we write them on the doorposts of our house and upon our gates. We are placing them as a sign of separation. Because he says, do these commands and you will be holy. So holiness is through an action, but it all begins with our motivation. Why are we doing these different things? Because of faith, because our hope, because of the promise. All of these things talk to the prophetic, which is why when Messiah is saying these things, he's saying, I'm the Messiah, without saying, I'm the Messiah. Because the Messiah was supposed to come and teach us about Adonai, talk about the promises of Adonai and the promises given to Israel, but it was also to illuminate or elaborate on the Torah in a way that we would bring greater understanding to the Torah. Because if he contradicted the Torah, Deuteronomy 13 would make him a false prophet. And then we got a bigger problem. If he came to do away with the Torah, then that makes him, according to Deuteronomy 13, a false prophet. And we don't believe that, so we're going to continue studying it from this other angle because I see no evidence of such. So, with that being said, let's move on to verse 11 and 12 out of Matthew chapter 5. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them, or there'll be some time afterwards if you don't want it to be on recording as well. Is sort of how we structure this. So then now let's get to verse 11 and 12. And it says, how blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and tell all kinds of vicious lies about you because you follow me. Rejoice and be glad because your reward in heaven is great. Remember, they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. This is a reminder. Yeshua is giving us a reminder that our reward is not for here. There's two parts of this. We shouldn't be going around as if we're trying to store up greater rewards in heaven, because if we're doing that, then we're sort of doing it in the wrong mindset. We're doing it for ourselves, right? We're doing it for, oh, I want to have all these jewels. I want to have all these wonderful things. That's sort of a pompous attitude. But instead, when we are doing it, knowing that Adonai will reward us for our efforts because he is a just God, and a just God, or in this case, a just boss, will rightly pay his servants or his workers. So we know that he will give us our reward in heaven, and so we don't have to worry about whether he gives us the reward here on earth. In Jewish thought, there's I wrote an incomplete sentence here, so I'm trying to rephrase this. So our reminder is that our reward is not we're not looking for the reward here on earth, but instead that such things are thought to be when we do receive persecution or insult, or we receive some of these things that he's talking about in 11 and 12, that in Jewish thought, these are recognized as little a atonement as to why these things take place, especially here on earth. And that by suffering here, there is less to diminish our reward in heaven. So think about that. So we look at the merits of what we have done, and we look forward to those rewards, but there's also things that detract from those merits. And sometimes those sufferings take place on earth in order to diminish what would take away from our reward in heaven, is another aspect of Jewish thought. And so there was a story that I came across, and I was trying to re-find it, and sadly I was not able to find it, but it was a story about a rabbi during the Holocaust. And they were in this little village, and not too far away from there was a German camp. And the rabbi, as well as I believe it was something like 10 or 11 other men, were commissioned to come to the German camp that night. And everyone understood that when you went to the Jewish camp, you didn't return. And so it was I wasn't given the story didn't divulge how far it was of a walk, but it was long enough that it took an extensive amount of time for them to get there. So they had to leave that night in order to report that morning. So whatever distance that was, you can kind of get an idea. So they had to walk from the city to the German camp to report, and it took them all night to get there. And so they're walking along, and the men that were with the rabbi, they're going, "This is terrible. This is terrible. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe God is allowing this to happen to us." And the rabbi stops and he says, "You guys are looking at this wrong. Instead of looking at how horrible this is to us, recognize that we're in a position of honor because we have been chosen to make atonement for this city." And it changes. When I read that story, it really kind of caused me to think differently about some of the things that we think about on this earth, of suffering and all these other aspects. Because when we think about it in that context, our suffering is about bringing atonement, a little bit of repair back to this world, even though we were not the one that was supposed to, receive that consequence, if you will. But by our walking righteousness and being falsely accused and all of these other things, we can also be put in a position to recognize that we could be used for a little bit of atonement, little a atonement for a city or a place. And I thought that was just really kind of an interesting way to kind of come back and look at what Messiah was saying here. How blessed are you? Because, clearly we would say, how happy are we when people insult us? Nobody here, I'm definitely guilty of that. I do not appreciate insults. I don't appreciate being persecuted. I don't appreciate lies about me. But he's saying, if you are having these things because you follow me, rejoice and be glad, because your reward is in heaven. Because all of these things are going back to walking righteously, not because I'm a believer, but instead I'm walking these things out because these are the commands that God has given us. And we have these things that are thrown against us. That our reward is great in heaven. Perhaps if we look at it through, Adonai has chosen us to provide a little bit of atonement. To me, it eases the sting of the situation a little bit. But all of these verses, or all of these previous verses I mentioned, as we go through what are called the Beatitudes, they point to and relate to prophecy, big S salvation, our promise, and our hope. Why do we believe? Why should we believe in this God of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Here is a list. Messiah is saying, here is a list of reasons why. And so now into verse 13, we transition into a little different section of his spiel, if you will, is his teaching, that Messiah is saying, here is the basic, here's the foundation of why we believe what we believe, because of the promise and the hope, and in the importance of us remaining humble, being poor in spirit, and all these different things. But now we get into verse 13. He's transitioning. And this was an interesting verse that as the more I dug, the more I found this to be interesting. It says, you are the salt for the land, but if the salt becomes tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except being thrown out for the people to trample on. Well, the first thing I had to, kind of go back to and review was, let's first start in Leviticus chapter 2. Leviticus chapter 2. And keep in mind, in the book of Leviticus, this is where we're talking about all the different offerings and so forth. And so what is one of the things that the priests are to bring? It says, you are to, verse 13, sorry. It says, you are to season every grain offering of yours with salt. So the offerings that are brought to Adonai on the altar are to be seasoned, the grain offerings in here are to be seasoned with salt. Do not, in fact, there's even more of an instruction, do not omit from your grain offering the offering of salt, or the offering of the salt of the covenant with your God, but offer salt with all your offerings. We sometimes overlook it, that we think of the frankincense that's supposed to be part of it, the oil that's supposed to be part of it, whether it's an animal for it, whether it's a grain that's supposed to be part of it, the chametz that we're supposed to take the 3 fingers and separate that, and that's to be burned on the altar, and the others are to be made in cakes, and all these other things. But the importance of salt was to be with every one of our offerings. Now let's go to Numbers chapter 18. And in verse 19, it says, all the contributions of the holy things which the people of Israel are to offer to Adonai, I have given to you, your sons and your daughters with you. This is a perpetual law, an eternal covenant of salt before Adonai for you and your descendants with you. In Berachot, which is, in this case, it'll be in the Talmud, but Berachot is from the Mishnah, meaning blessings, a book of blessings in the Mishnah, but this is going to come from the Talmud. Berachot 5a, verse 19. And that is the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Lachish. Also, Rabbi Shimon ben Lachish said, the word covenant is used with regard to salt, and the word covenant is used with regards to, right? And the word covenant is used with regard to affliction. The word covenant is used with regard, and this is speaking to the covenant of salt. As it is written, the salt of the covenant with your God should not be excluded from your meal offerings. With all your sacrifices, you must offer salt, as we read in Leviticus chapter 2. And the word covenant is used with regards to afflictions, as it is written, these are the words of the covenant, Deuteronomy 28:69. Just as the covenant mentioned with regard to the salt sweetens the taste of meat and renders it edible. So too in the covenant mentioned with regard to suffering, the suffering cleanses a person's transgressions, purifying him for a more sublime existence. So salt can be used to preserve, to season, but it can also be used to purify. And we've all used the expression of, or heard the expression of putting salt in a wound, right? Well, they used to put salt in the wound to cleanse the salt, or cleanse the wound using salt because it would preserve it from infection. So it can sometimes, so we can see a connection with suffering in conjunction with the salt as well. Rambam, also known as Maimonides, points out that just as salt never spoils, just like we read in Numbers 18 here, it says an eternal covenant, a perpetual law. Rambam points out that just as salt never spoils, so too this covenant will be forever. In Jewish tradition, we remind ourselves this covenant every Shabbat with the challah. If you've ever been to a Jewish home on Erev Shabbat, that will have typically, traditionally they'll have a little bowl of salt out there as well, and you take the challah and you dip the challah into the salt to remind us the covenant of salt. And if you ever look at the challah recipes, they typically have more salt in the challah than a traditional loaf of bread. And that's also part of the reason. But now if we go back to Matthew chapter 5, oops, and I used the wrong one. So we'll go back to Matthew chapter 5. I just said something that was contradictory to what Messiah said. It says, but if the salt becomes tasteless, and I just got done saying that salt never spoils, how can it become tasteless? How can salt become tasteless? This is something I've chewed on, or not to be pun not intended, but it was this is something I've really contemplated a long time, because salt doesn't change. I mean, it's sodium chloride, and sodium chloride doesn't change and lose itself over time. It's us. Let me offer this idea. Salt does not lose its taste except for when it's tainted by unwholesome other ingredients. When it is mixed with. Yes, part of this points to suffering and affliction, but it is a reminder that we are not to become tainted either. And I used the thought that came to my mind was a number of years ago. I had I think it was Himalayan pink salt or whatever, the pink salt, and it was in large pieces, and it had a little crusher, or what do you call them, grinder on the top of it, one of those little fancy bottles. And I don't remember how this happened, but I remember when some oil got into that salt, and the oil actually went bad, and the salt didn't necessarily lose its saltiness, but it was no longer effective in the same way because it was tainted and became no good, and I had to throw it out. And I thought that may be what Messiah is talking about. Because once I had that, that was literally the thought. How can I make this salt good salt again once it's been tainted? It's tainted with oil in this case, and the oil went bad, and I'm sitting there going, okay, so I can't just put it in a bowl of water, dissolve it all together, and then distill it back into its salt form, because oil and water don't mix. And so how am I going to, to me, it literally was no longer good for anything except for being thrown out, which is what I did. But as I was studying this, I couldn't help but go to Deuteronomy chapter 7. And be reminded of this passage. Perhaps this is what Messiah was talking about when he was referring to Israel is to have the covenant of salt, which is to preserve us, and we are preserved forever. But at the same time, we have to be careful that we do not become tainted with what Moses tells us, or Moshe tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 7. I want to read verses 1 through 6. It says, Adonai your God is going to bring you into the land you enter in order to take possession of it. And he will expel many nations ahead of you, the Hittite, the Girgashite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, and Hivi, and Yebusi, 7 nations bigger and stronger than you. When he does this, when Adonai your God hands them over to you, ahead of you, and you defeat them, you are to destroy them completely. Do not make any covenant with them. Show them no mercy. But here's the pieces where I found, so that gives us the context. But these next verses are the part that I couldn't resist but think in connection. Don't intermarry with them. Don't give your daughter to his son, and don't take his daughter for your son. For he will turn your children away, for he will turn your children away from following me in order to serve other gods. If this happens, the anger of Adonai will flare up against you, and he will just quickly destroy you. No, treat them this way: break down their altars, smash down their standing altars or standing stones to pieces, cut down their sacred poles, and burn up their carved images completely. For you are a people set apart as holy for Adonai. Adonai, your God, has chosen you out of all the people on the face of the earth to be his own unique treasure. Salt is unique in the way that it is. And as I think about essentially that idea of do not become tainted as the salt of the earth, if we are called to be the salt of the earth, that we need to be careful, because the only way that salt can be destroyed is if it is intermingled with something that is unwholesome. Like I said, with that it wasn't olive oil. I don't remember what oil it was, but it was oil that had gone rancid. The salt wasn't going to bring the unrancid the oil to it, but at the same time, there was nothing I could do to bring the saltiness back to that salt. Is that not the same thing that he mentions in Deuteronomy 7? Do not intermingle, because what happens? You will begin to follow after their God. You will become tainted. And once you become tainted, you're no longer any good to me. I'll take it a step further. When Israel, I'll start. This is why you've probably heard of the idea, do not be unequally yoked. We get this idea from this concept. because this can taint us against the covenant of salt that we are called, as we mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 7. When Israel loses the covenant of salt, the curse is, or the consequences, we call it says blessings and curses, right, in the Torah. But the curse is, or the consequence is, we get kicked out. We get kicked out. And when Israel loses that and gets kicked out and becomes what? Subjugated to the nations. And we also see that part of the exile is what? Have we seen an exile yet where Israel has not, or the Jewish people have not been persecuted? We saw that in Exodus. We saw that with the Persian exile, Babylonian Persian exile. And we've seen it in the third exile numerous times, whether you look at the Holocaust, the pogroms, the Inquisitions. I mean, the list is numerous. And why are we in exile? Because we became tainted. Our people became tainted and we become exiled. And perhaps that's the metaphor of our being thrown out and trampled under people's feet. But their hope is, no matter where we are, even where we read in Deuteronomy 30, the hope is as we return to Adonai, and if we are persecuted during this time, and we are persecuted while we have been tainted, but we return to Adonai our God, He purifies us, and we follow His ways. He's the one that made us holy. Then we know that the persecution that we may have received beforehand, as I said before, we know that the reward is in heaven. And this is why you'll see, especially within Judaism, as we talked last week about, grafting in, there's a hedge of protection within Jewish thought. Why? Because of this preservation. Israel numerously, and throughout history, you just read your Tanakh and you'll see that Israel, when they didn't guard the Torah in this way, they became tainted. The northern kingdom became tainted. So Judah, the southern kingdom, said, well, we're going to put up these walls, and unless we know where you come from, we're going to be very isolated mentality. And so we're really going to put a number of processes. Even to this day, there's a number of processes that they kind of put it as refinement, but also resistance for somebody who wants to convert to Judaism. The expression is, if somebody comes to you and asks and says, I want to convert to Judaism, you are to deny him 3 times. You said, no, you don't want to do that. You're supposed to tell them no 3 times, because you're to dissuade them, because you want to check to make sure that what is in their heart, whether they truly are wanting to become obedient to God. And in our world, we sort of sometimes we take this expression, we go, oh, well, that's rude, that's harsh, that's mean. But at the same time, if we understand the covenant of salt, to me, it made such a clearer picture of why they do that. Again, I'm not justifying the reasoning, but I can at least understand and appreciate why they do those things. And this is, we see as I'm saying these things, it's why we see this preservation of the same mentality. It's still very strong and conservative into ultra-Orthodox communities. Got some friends who, made some waves because they believed in Yeshua in more of an Orthodox community. And they were cast out and put all these things because they believed in Yeshua. Not because of anything else, but because they believed in Yeshua, they were kicked out of the community and literally persecuted. They had news articles and things that ran against them. And it was, all of these things, all because they made it known that they believed Yeshua was the Messiah. purification is still there, but I would say sometimes we overlook what does it mean to have that covenant of salt. And that's, again, I know that can be sometimes a sticky situation and so forth, but that's where we are today. Hopefully that explains where we are today, how we got here, why are we here. But at the same time, as Messianics, well, they may reject me because, well, no, I should say they will reject me. They have rejected me numerous times because I believe Yeshua is the Messiah. And I'm okay with that. Because I cannot in good conscience deny him that he's the Messiah. I cannot deny he's the Messiah. And so, okay, I'm not Jewish to you. Okay, whatever. But I'm also trying to not only uphold, but support the Torah, which we see a little bit later in this chapter. And we'll talk more about that as we get there. But the saltiness, but to remember that salt is we've got to, again, be careful with how we season people's lives. We can make it more flavorful, and how with our relationship with God, we can be used to preserve some things. But also salt, if it's not used carefully, can also kill things, can destroy things. Too much salt causes, plants to die. Nothing there. So we have to be mindful of what does this mean? And I think that just goes back to, with the knowledge and the understanding of the things that we have, we need to be careful with how we walk those things out.